Louder.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So Dr. Monto Muni sir is a professor, Center for Sustainable Technologies and Center for Product Design and Manufacturing, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He did BArch at BKBS College of Architecture, University of Pune, and Master and PhD from IIT Madras, Chennai. Dr. Mani has supervised more than 130 individual projects on sustainability assessment as a part of the course Technology and Sustainability. He has co-authored a book on sustainability in human settlements, co-edited 3 books, and has extensive international journal and conference publications on diverse areas pertaining to sustainability. He has been guest editor for a special section in Current Science on design for well-being published in 2015. Dr. Mani has received the Cambridge Hind Fellowship for academic collaboration in areas of sustainable manufacturing and smart buildings at the University of Cambridge. He is a panel member of the Bureau of Indian Standards National Building Code 2016 on sustainability consideration in buildings. Dr. Mani is currently coordinating a scientific study on the Kaveri River basin, specifically looking into the biodiversity and sustainability. So due to the time constraint, I stop with this brief intro and I pass on to Yuvraj sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Now I request Professor. Now I request Professor Montomani sir to take over the session. Sir, please, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will try to share my screen now. Is my screen visible now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So like I said, the title of the talk is Sustainability Challenges in Buildings, and I'll be covering a lot.
Yeah, sir.
Environment. So the picture that you see on the left is a photovoltaic lab that we have. And on the top right, the picture that you see is below the roof, photovoltaic roof. And that's a table made with photovoltaic panels. I will come to that later. And these are some of the design projects that we have taken and the awards that we have won. So I am with the 2 departments here, the Center for Sustainable Technologies and Center for Product Design. And the work with CST involves like building integrated photovoltaics, which we started way back in 2006. That was a industry academia collaboration where BHA wanted to look at photovoltaic integration, and what we were interested in is to understand what happens if a roof is made with photovoltaics in terms of indoor thermal comfort, building thermal performance. We also sent a small test sample to Antarctica way back in 2018 just to study how would organic photovoltaic cells, this was in collaboration with my colleague, how would organic photovoltaic cells perform under sub-zero conditions. Now, given climate change, I really doubt whether Antarctica would remain sub-zero for a long time, which is a challenge again for all of us in terms of climate zone changes and sea level rise and increasing climate uncertainties. Then we also look at building climatic response, where we look at how thermal vernacular dwellings and modern dwellings respond climatically, and try to understand if they are doing bad, why are they doing bad, and if they're doing good, trying to figure out the material and design configurations that are suitable for particular climates. We also have a test facility we call Hotbox, which unfortunately hasn't been in operation for nearly 18 months now due to the pandemic. We're trying that by September, October, we will get that up and running. And the idea is to simulate various climates, that is, regulate the temperature and humidity on either side of a building material. hygroscopic part we are still getting into in a domain called moisture buffering, where we are seeing whether natural materials can help in regulating indoor moisture conditions. Then there's a small project we have looking at urban lakes and the impact they have on the surrounding and the sustainability of the lake itself. And that part actually connects with my doctoral work, where we looked at attitude as a determinant of sustainability. And we can even predict how the urban form would change given the attitude of the people there. You know, if they're sensitive to the environment, then the built environment evolves with a lot of greenery, clean, maintenance and things like that. If people disregard the environment, then the lake gets encroached, the lake becomes a dump for all our waste, and then accordingly the environmental problems start to occur. Then on the bottom left, this is a project that Professor Reddy and I had taken up way back in 2006, 2005, 2006. This was a tsunami affected island village, a place called Kodayampalayam, which is close to Chidambaram. We rehabilitated about 150 houses, and the innovative part we brought in was in the sanitation. I will be explaining that in the course of this presentation. And we also have been looking at rapid construction for rural areas, using local materials. Then we also, another doctoral student looked at stoves which could be made using the local soil. And today skill is a problem, particularly skilled and semi-skilled workers. And across urban areas and rural areas, it's a serious problem. So if we have to build stoves which are energy efficient, then we came up with a descaling technology. So that's what you see on the right-hand side. Then with our projects that we do with Center for Product Design, we have one student looking at sustainability assessment in manufacturing. And am I audible or is there too much disturbance?
Yes, sir. Audible, sir.
Okay. There's some construction activity happening nearby. So just excuse, or if you're not able to hear me at all, then let me know. Then we are looking at
No problem,
manufacturing today. Okay. Manufacturing today, any product you see is not manufactured at one place. It involves a material source from different geographies, manufactured somewhere, assembled somewhere else, different components coming somewhere else. It is purchased and used somewhere else, disposed somewhere else. So from a sustainability point of view, that's important because we need to assess what is the impact of those activities in the geographies in which they occur. So there's one framework we're developing now. And there's also another student, just give me 1 minute, let me see if I can, that noise is coming, right? Some cutting noise?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Just give me 1 second.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. Then we have another research work, again an architecture student looking at energy neutrality in buildings. I'll explain that also. These are some of the projects that we've been taken. I'll also explain the last project here where there's something that we've been working on for a few years, but still we've not been able to take it to society and commercialize. It's a sewer cleaning system, particularly to eliminate manual entry into manholes and cleaning up these systems. So we won a national award for this from Lexus, which is an automobile company. So we won the Lexus Design Award in 2019, and all this product and its details were featured even in the Milan Design Week in early 2020. I'm correct. So I will move on now. So this is just to give you a context in terms of our ecological footprint and satisfaction with life. This is from a book called the Zero Energy Development Book. And what they did was they tried to map the satisfaction with life of the people and the ecological footprint. And the ecological footprint here is the land area required to support the lifestyle that we have. So if I'm wearing a cotton shirt, it is grown somewhere, it is getting processed somewhere, dyed somewhere, and like converted into cloth somewhere. So when those sort of things happen, then there's a land area that is associated, and that land area is measured in terms of global hectares per capita. And here again, this particular book brought in a different metrics for satisfaction with life. At one time, it was income levels and purchasing power, global GDP and things like that. Now they are looking at factors like, are you happy with the job that you have? Are you having time with friends and family? Are you contented with your job? So if you bring in that metrics, then the whole thing changes. And here you will see there's no correlation between global hectares or the ecological footprint and satisfaction with life. And very often you will see that the poorer countries show a very high satisfaction with life despite not having that much of an environmental footprint. And this can also come from the fundamental difference between the Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. Most of the Western philosophy actually tells or dictates that, go after your desires, have a very materialistic life, and then you're happy. But the Eastern philosophy exactly says opposite. It says that have no desires and you're happy. And very often what happens is that we follow the modern lifestyle that we have is a Western philosophy right now. We follow that up till retirement. And post-retirement, we follow the Eastern philosophy and say we'll do good to the environment, we won't consume so much, I'll live a simple life and things like that. So this is something that is fundamental for us to recognize, because our economy right now is depends on consumerism, right? So that is, every day I should consume more than what I was consuming yesterday. In which case, we cannot talk of sustainability in a exponentially increasing consumerism, right? Then we have the other aspect again connected with that slide is happiness. Here, very often people connected happiness with income, saying that with income levels going up, people are likely to be happy, but that isn't so. And even, this is very clear, even in villages, people are much happier. And in city, you find that people are not as happy as they were when they didn't have so much, or when their earnings were not so much. So I'll just leave these images with you in terms of world over what is really happening, in terms of food, in terms of hunger and things like that. And I'll tell you the connection with the built environment, energy here. And this is also the case with India, where the gap between the haves and the have-nots is quite a lot. So I will now come specifically into the building environment. You will see two pictures here. The dwelling on the left is very traditional vernacular construction in... just give me 1 second. Where is that? Can you just give me 1 minute? I'll just mute myself. Just give me 1 minute. Or can I continue? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
So I'll just continue then. It's difficult to. Yeah. So, and the building on the right is what we call the building integrated photovoltaics. And here we are trying to generate as much energy as we consume, right? The building on the left doesn't have any electricity supply. And electricity is the face of modern energy requirement. So the building on the left is actually zero energy because they are surviving, they are managing without the electricity supply. Right? They're using firewood and for cooking and things like that, but they don't have any energy going into their dwellings in terms of air conditioning, fans, and things like that. The dwelling on the right is a lab. Actually, it's not a dwelling. It's a lab, and it's about a 9 kilowatt system right now. And we are generating as much as we consume. So that is energy zero. So the net energy generated and the energy consumed, we sort of keep that to zero. So I will come to this. And when we started studying this building way back, and this is something that I took up when I was with IIT Kharagpur. I'm talking about way back 2004, 2005. And this was a dwelling about 60 kilometers from Kharagpur. And when we started to study it, we only wanted to study how it performs climatically. And when we got into it, we found that we had to not only study the building, we had to study their agricultural practices, we had to study the local soil, their local cultural practices. Everything was connected with the dwelling, right? And if you see, these houses don't have any walls and security cameras and things like that, like we have in the urban areas, which means that it's reflecting the fact that robbery is not a serious problem. The need for very great privacy or isolation is not much. So the design itself tells a lot about the lifestyle in that particular area, right? And when we started monitoring the temperatures there, what we found was that even in extreme, when the outdoor temperature variations were going from say 28 degrees to 30 degrees or 38 degrees, about 10 degree, 12 degree variation, the indoor temperature remained confined within 2 degrees. And this is difficult to manage even in modern dwellings. With this extreme variability outside, our air conditioners are still not able to maintain a 1 degree, 2 degree band of comfort within. They still vary about 3 degrees, 4 degrees, right? And the other part we also look at is end of life. And here what happens is that once the roof is taken off, it's local soil and it just merges with the environment and there's no toxicity to worry about. Today, if you see along any road you go, along any river that you go, you will see so much of plastic, so much of garbage, so much of diapers, so much of industrial rejects, rubber and, seat covers and sofas and all that are dumped, okay? Because we still don't have a policy how to handle them and all that ends up in the river. And unfortunately, lakes and all of these is the mindset that we're carrying because we expect that the garbage management system or the government should take care of it. And you know how the entire government setup is. It's not as refined or as structured as it should be. So the other problem that we also witnessed when we started studying, I will tell you a little more about this dwelling, is that there are no pests in this house. It's comfortable throughout the year without any air conditioning. And what we found is that these houses are called Kacha houses. So the government is wanting to promote modern houses, more permanent houses. And once they move into permanent houses, they find that the pest attack in those houses increases, particularly when they store food grains in that house, right? So we're still not able to understand why. Because this has a lot of thatch and thatch should have a lot of pests in them and insects and things like that. So why is it that the food grain stored in this house doesn't require any pesticides or insecticides, right? So in modern houses, you need that. So it's very intriguing to understand that simpler houses, locally derived houses, vernacular houses have no problem whatsoever with pests and toxicity. Whereas modern houses, starting with the building materials that we start using, there is a lot of toxicity associated with them. These are the changes that I was telling you, right? The roof changes from thatch to, corrugated cement sheets or corrugated GI sheets. And with this, the temperature of the house completely changes. The indoor temperatures change. And what we find is that the house that you see on the bottom right is a house where they start to use bricks and cement and things like that. And that usually happens when there is somebody who goes to the city, earns some money, and comes back and wants to live a modern life. He doesn't want to live like the way his father was living. So that starts to be a fragmentation in the family. Originally, the traditional house actually, once the son gets married, comes with the wife and the family, they build an additional room to the house, but the family space remains the same. So there is integrity. The family still remains joined. Whereas in this case, it becomes difficult because the son wants to live separate, wants to have his own identity. Then thatch, they say, is a very not so durable material. So every 5 years, 6 years, it requires to change. And what we found is that for the thatch roof that is used, they have food grains that they keep, which give them the crops to a particular height, which they can cut and use for the roof. And they do that every 5 years or 6 years. So there's an agricultural planning also associated with it. And once the roof needs to be done, the entire community gets together to help. So again, within the community, there is integrity associated with the dwelling. All that starts to fall apart once we move into modern dwellings. Right? So these are factors which are very important when we are looking at sustainability. And when we looked at a simple life cycle assessment, this is something that we did long back. We found that for every change that happens from a traditional vernacular dwelling to a modern dwelling, there is almost 6 tons of carbon dioxide addition. Right? And that, if you multiply that with the changes that are happening, and we published this paper in 2012, changes that are happening across the country, people adopting newer building materials, we find that this can significantly alter the overall footprint in terms of carbon dioxide emissions attributed to buildings. And we have still not been able to address this. Now, if you look at the economy, people will say, oh, more steel consumption, more aluminum construction, more rapid construction, it is good for the economy. But in terms of the climate change that's already happening, the energy intensity of the houses, are we sustainable? That's a question that we have to ask ourselves. If not, what are the alternatives? Right? And people will generally come and ask me, are you asking me to go back to traditional villages, live in thatch house? That is a question that is immediately posed to me. The answer is not that. The answer is, can we come up with modern dwellings which perform in a low energy manner like the way vernacular dwellings are functioning, right? Can we come up with, I'll give you an example here. The thatch houses will usually have about 66 degrees outside temperature, and about the tin sheet will also have 66 degrees outside. The clay tile Mangalore tiles roof will have about 64 degrees outside. But if you see the inside surface temperature, the GI sheet will have 64 outside, 64 inside. The clay tile, there's a 2-degree difference. But the thatch roof has a 24-degree difference between the outside surface temperature and the inside surface temperature. Right? And we can say that the thatch roof is about 9 inches thick, 6 inches to 9 inches thick. Now the challenge for us is that can we come up with a building material or a roofing material which gives you the same temperature difference, right? Which is non-toxic. Today we have sandwich panels, puff sandwich panels. Now all of these, what happens at end of life, right? If you look at end of life of a thatch roof versus end of life of a sandwich panel roof with powder coating, the environmental consequences are not the same, right? So these are factors that one needs to keep in mind from a sustainability point of view. So this is the overall picture I can give you about the built environment. And like we deal with two energies when we consider the built environment. One is embodied energy, which is the energy going into manufacturing and installing building materials. And the other is operational energy. And operational energy essentially is the energy going into operating and making a building comfortable. Right now you might be having a fan, you might be sitting in an AC room. Those are all operational energy. So if you see vernacular dwellings on the bottom right, their operational energy is less than 1 gigajoules per household per year. The embodied energy of the building materials is about 2 gigajoules per meter square. When we go to city level naturally ventilated buildings, the operational energy goes from 1 to 15. Embodied energy goes from 2 to 4. Right? But the same thing if you see for modern buildings with air conditioned, smart buildings, that your operational energy goes from 1 to 42 and your embodied energy goes from 2 to 8. Right? Now, if you look at the implications of this, we are looking at a 40 times increase in operational energy and a 4-time increase in embodied energy. And we don't have the energy resources right now. Even if we look at renewables, wind farms, solar and all of that. And I'll tell you there are other issues connected with these as well. So in this matrix, what we also try to look at is what are the ways in which we can provide or meet their energy requirement. So if you look at the bottom right, the small photovoltaic panels are enough. Firewood is enough to cater to cooking requirement. If you look at energy efficient stoves, more than enough, right? Then if you go with more or increased energy intensity, then we again look at concentrated solar, building integrated photovoltaics. But then when you look at an apartment block, even solar is not going to be enough. Then we have to look at nuclear or those sort of alternatives coming from elsewhere, through grid and catering to our requirement. And then if you go further down or in intensity, we are looking at much larger intensities. So I'm not so sure whether going the way, gigawatts and gigawatts of installing photovoltaics is the answer. Unless and otherwise, we are able to limit our per capita energy consumption. And I'll tell you the concept of rebound effect. Rebound effect is our per capita energy consumption going up because of the fact that our efficiency of our appliances is going up, right? If you take, for example, 10 years back, all of us didn't have mobile phones. We probably had a desktop. Few of us had the luxury of a laptop, right? Those desktop and those laptops were not efficient as they are today. Today, if you see, each one of us has a mobile phone. We probably also have a spare mobile phone which we don't know what to do with, right? We also have a laptop. We probably have a tablet also. We also have a desktop at home. So at one time, the desktop that we had access to was only on the office side. At home, it used to be just one desktop for the entire family. Now each one has their own tablets. Each one have their own laptops, right? So though these are energy efficient, our per capita energy consumption is only going up, right? So this is what is the rebound effect. When energy efficiency was brought in to reduce our energy consumption, it is actually resulting in our net energy consumption going up, right? And many government reports in their energy estimates or resource or consumption estimates put a footprint there saying that we have not accounted for the rebound effect. And rebound effect is something very, very, very active, and we have not yet estimated it. Europe, even places like Germany, they are going through a rebound effect of 200%, 300%. When they were expecting that our lifestyle energies will go down, it's only going up. And so is the waste. And today, for example, with food and our Zomato and all these things coming, our incentive to cook at home has also gone down, right? And if you see, for the same lifestyle that we probably had for the last 10 years, our waste has correspondingly increased. Our packaging waste has increased. Our reliance on delivered goods has increased. And if you account for all of that, then we again are looking at sustainability issues in the built environment, right? And you look at any drain in the city, you'll find plastic bottles, plastic covers, shampoo sachets, toffee covers, everything. Did we anticipate all of this? Is the built environment geared to handle all of this, right? Now we'll come to this whole aspect of adaptability, right, in buildings. And this slide is actually a framework that we are developing with a doctoral student who will be submitting a thesis soon on this. Is the built environment and the cluster. And the buildings are actually supposed to cater to structural safety, space utilization, durability in terms of able to withstand the wear and tear that is required. Of course, thermal comfort, indoor lighting and acoustics, and renewable energy. Right. Again, the factors that influence thermal comfort is form, material, and things like that. And the natural environment factors we know: climate, weather conditions, microclimatic conditions, and things like that. So if you look at all of this, we will see that today, with climate change coming, there is a risk that a particular climate zone will shift. So for example, a warm, humid zone could become hot, dry, or it could become temperate, right? In which case, are the dwellings in those particular climatic zones suited to these changes that are likely to happen? So we presented this work at the conference in 2019 in Dubai. It was held by the Heriot-Watt University. There we also won the Best Paper Award, the students who presented this. And what we did is that we only made an assessment in terms of what happens to indoor thermal comfort. And we looked at the adaptive model. And what the adaptive model says is that the human body adapts to the changing, climatic conditions. So we feel comfortable at a higher temperature in summer and at a lower temperature in winter. So accounting for that, what we said is if we're looking at traditional dwellings and modern dwellings, we find that the traditional dwellings, the thermal comfort band within which the indoor temperature, regime lies for the entire year is much higher. And with climate change happening, we find that the conventional dwellings, we are going to be far more uncomfortable. And this is only going to increase. Whereas our vernacular dwellings would be able to withstand changing climate as well without any intervention as of now, right? Whereas conventional dwellings will require intervention in terms of fans or air conditioning, which again means consuming more power, and consuming more power, even if it is from photovoltaics, essentially means contributing to global warming, right? And people are already talking about redefining climatic zones. We are actually working on even reclassifying the climatic zones, but that is still very uncertain, right? Because the way the extreme weather events are happening and the climatic parameters are changing right now, it's very uncertain, right? And then we have the pandemic also. And then we have global unrest also, like what's happening with the dominance of China, Afghanistan, we all know it's very uncertain for all of us today. We further came up, we were requested to submit a paper in fact, we submitted this to Nature, and it got published in Scientific Reports, which is published by Nature. And we further investigated this. And we looked at 3 different locations: Sugainhalli, Dasanhalli, and Bisoy. And we again found similar trends in terms of changes, transitions, and we were trying to document how the traditional dwellings are changing into modern dwellings and which of these dwellings are more suitable to withstand climate change. And we looked at a few scenarios from the IPCC report. And we again found that the traditional dwellings are far more suitable as compared to conventional dwellings in terms of withstanding climate change, right? And these 2 are certain scenarios we've looked at. The future scenarios again are not so clear for the simple reason that with the way the climate trend is progressing now, for the next 50 years, there's nothing that we can do. That is, whatever intervention we do today will not have an impact for the next 50 years. It will only have an impact following the 50 years. That is, what is going to happen for the next 50 years is already set. We can only decide what can happen 50 years from now. So in that angle also, many of us can say that, see, I'm not going to be alive, who cares? Let the guys who are going to be there after 50 years worry about it. Or we really say, no, I should sacrifice certain things in my lifestyle today to see that people or the generations that are likely to be there after 50 years, can probably have a greater chance of, sustaining themselves. There are many attitudinal changes that we need to also bring in. Now, like I said, I'm covering different facets of the work that we're doing. And the other facet that we're looking at is energy neutrality. Again, this is a student who looked at smart buildings. And with smart buildings, we are also today saying, oh, it will save energy. I walk into the room, the light will go on. I leave the room, the light will switch off. But is that really good? Okay. And I'll give you one example. That in my office right now, I have a smart sensor. So when I come in, the light goes on. When I leave, the light goes off. Right? But then once mentally at the subconscious level, if I start believing that my light will go on, and when I'm entering the room, when I leave the room, it goes off. And when I go home, I enter the hall, I switch on the light because obviously I don't have a smart sensor there. But when I leave the hall, at subconscious level, I feel that the light will go on, will go off by itself. And I keep doing this wherever I visit, and you will find that these behavioral changes are actually causing a resulting net energy consumption, though I might be saving a little energy at some point in some place, right? The second aspect is the energy efficiency part. I'll again connect to the rebound effect. Today, the lighting that we have is very, very efficient as compared to the filament-based bulb. So, when appliances become more and more efficient, their scope to save energy actually goes down, right? So here we try to come up with a framework to understand where does it make sense to put sensors and where does it not make sense to put sensors. Right? I'll give you an example here. So we took a motion sensor, and we said that this motion sensor connected to an LED light. And we said, okay, the motion sensor is manufactured in Shanghai. It's shipped all the way to Bangalore. And we calculated very meticulously. We bought it on Amazon. So we calculated where it was sourced on Amazon, the packaging material, the energy going into manufacturing this packaging material. We opened the sensor. We looked at the chips inside. We looked at where they were manufactured. We got the data for that. So we went very meticulous to understand the total energy footprint associated with manufacturing of that sensor, right? And then we said we'll come up with this gram per wattage ratio, which is gram of the weight of the sensor versus the wattage of the load connected to it. And what we found is that when it's a gram per wattage, your incandescent light, which is very inefficient, is able to recover a lot of energy saving due to that sensor as compared to an LED light. So an incandescent light will be able to recover the energy in half a year itself. Whereas for an LED light, it will take you 11 years for you to recover the light. This means that the energy going into making the sensor and the energy saved by it is equal. It takes 11 years for this to be even, right? So, but if the same may not be the case if you're connecting a motion sensor to an air conditioning unit or connecting a motion sensor to your computer or something like that. So we are now coming up with this entire framework for a building and seeing where does it make sense, what is the energy neutrality. So the 3 case studies we have taken, I think that those publications will be out maybe in another 7 or 8 months. But these are the factors that we have to look at, and we are still not looking at behavioral changes, right? Today there is, you can have a light connected and you have a mobile phone app with which you can switch it on, switch it off, which means that the incentive for you to get up and go switch off or switch on is going down. That means you're leading a more and more sedentary life, which means that again, the need for you to, look at a gym option or exercising option or things like that, again falls on you because end up with arthritis and those sort of problems. Nobody will be able to link small technological interventions like this to serious lifestyle health problems, right? Yeah, so this is what, if you're looking at the transportation energy that you see between made in China and made in India, you will see that the shipping cost from Shanghai to Bangalore is so high that we need to promote local manufacturing. And this is global. That is, if communities start to rely on products manufactured locally, then you will see that the diversity is also there. That is where, if you go abroad, you go to Europe, you will see the cups are made in a particular way. There is diversity and everyone likes diversity. But you now see the way our coffee goes, say Coffee Cafe Day or Starbucks or any of these. Anywhere in the world you go, the coffee tastes the same, right? The cups are the same. Once you enter, the interiors are the same, right? So you will see that with this standardization, our yearning for diversity actually starts to also, get affected very badly, right? Because very often we'll go roadside tea shops, you will see there's a difference in the tea that one person makes versus the way other person makes. And it is this diversity that we're yearning for, because with the standard life, it will become very, very tasteless, right? So these are the other dimensions of sustainability I'm talking about, right? Then this is also another small little work that we took up, and again connected with the price we need to pay for efficiency. Now LED lights, many of us are having serious eyesight problems, right? That is the reason why in your mobile phones also today you have night mode so that it does not affect your sleep cycle. It's not only that, it is that light has an impact on the way your body generates hormones. So in bright light, your body generates hormones required to be alert, to be active, right? And when you're exposed to that light at night, you don't fall asleep because the body's hormonal balance, the endocrine system is affected. Now, nobody anticipated this, right? And that's why now you have LED screens, which mobile or other desktop screens, which say blue light filter or low blue light screen. And we had this problem because students were complaining with the LED lights that we had put. Some were complaining of headaches, some were complaining of being unable to sleep. And we found that across the world, there are problems associated with LEDs. And with LED street lights, we find that they're also affecting wildlife, right? A lot of the nocturnal wildlife. This was not the problem with the halogen bulb or sodium vapor bulb, which was similar to fire burning. And it wasn't affecting our eyesight as badly as LEDs. So, and we actually took up all the commercially available lights, and we looked at the spectral response in terms of the energy over the wavelength. And we found that LED has this blue peak that you're seeing here, which is the reason why it is causing all these problems. The light orangish trend that you see is the indoor natural light that comes early morning. The filament-based bulb is the next one, light brownish color, right? So we then were able to identify a filter which is able to cut this and bring it to this orange. And this filter is a material, polyamide material called Kapton. It is used extensively in the 3D printing industry, in the electronics industry. It's available commercially. And we actually published this in Down to Earth so that people can use this and make their lights safe. These lights are not perfect in terms of color rendering. You might feel a little gaudy, little yellowish, Your natural light when you're seeing a photograph might change when you're working under that light. But the feedback we've got is that at night when you work under this light, it doesn't affect your sleep, one, and it feels far comfortable for the eyes. We've been using it in the lab now for more than 2 years. And I've been getting a lot of requests from people abroad here saying, how do they fix this? And a lot of industries have adopted it. And the slide that we had given them was, okay, for tube lights, if we have to do this, how do you do it? For LED lamps, how do we do it? Even your car, lights, your dashboard, or a glove box or things like that, you can use this. But like I said, we've not studied this completely, and this light is not a bright white light, but is definitely safer on your eyes, right? So this is the price we have to pay for efficiency. We are adopting LEDs because they are super efficient, but it's affecting our eyes. Exposure to LED based white light actually causes retinal cell deaths, right? And it causes a lot of eye strain, and it also adds to our temperament because it makes us impulsive, short-tempered. This I wasn't aware until a professor in Germany came and told me. He said, Monto, if you work under a constant LED light, we find that those people fight more than they would otherwise. One would never expect, interventions like this in buildings will have a direct bearing on the temperament of people and their working. Now again, coming to our great solar, and this is again, I think some of you who heard me before would have seen these slides, that if I were to cover 25% of Bangalore's buildings with photovoltaics and assume a very low efficiency, I will still get about 12 units of energy per person per day. But my current consumption is about 2 units. And is it really worthwhile going for the additional 10 units of energy, right? And this is where I was trying to tell you, if you recollect the 2 photographs I had shown you of children on the road collecting corn seeds and this boy outside the pizza shop, you will see the correlation here, right? You will see that on the left-hand side is the world malnourishment map, which means that people are not nourished as much as they are. And India is also technically malnourished, right? Despite the fact that we are growing enough surplus, right? There are other issues, distribution issues, political issues. I'm not getting into that. But if you look at the bottom right, you will see that India is also surplus in terms of solar energy. And it doesn't make sense that world over, regions which are rich in solar are also the regions which are malnourished, right? So from an engineering point of view, it doesn't make sense because a country which is solar rich should potentially be able to grow crops because crops require sunlight. And why are those regions also malnourished, right? And the problem is this, when you go solar, we have to clear up the entire place. It's not a green technology where, it can grow with crops. Wherever you see farmlands are cleared, now they are talking of something called agrivoltaics, right? Now, agrivoltaics is going to be again a problem because today farmers are not finding laborers to work for the farm. They are able to give out their land for photovoltaics and sit at home, relax and get money. And increasingly, if farmers are going to do this, then who is going to grow food for you? That becomes a serious problem. Second is that the current photovoltaics, the silicon based, the solar energy that is required to be converted to electricity and the solar energy that is required, the spectrum that is required for crops is more or less the same. You cannot have both in the same place and both being very successful. There will be some degree of success, but it is not going to be sustainable that can be adopted on mass scale, right? That is also another challenge. And finally, it comes down to the maintenance also. Here we find that about half a liter of water is required per meter square per day to clean the panels, and this is clean water. You can't use recycled water, or you can't use salt water or sea water to clean solar photovoltaic panels. And when you're using about half a liter of water per meter square per day, it's a lot of water when you're looking at acres and hectares of land being devoted for photovoltaic panels, right? So the challenges that we again face is agriculture, biofuel, biodiversity loss, and a growing population. All of these needs land, right? And we also found that if you're looking at embodied energy, the energy going into manufacturing photovoltaic panels is also very high. So it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years on an average for the photovoltaic system to start generating or becoming energy positive, right? Now coming to this whole COVID situation, now that we are working from home, operating from home and things like that, it has completely cut down the need for travel, which is good. Many of the IT people are saying that instead of spending 3 hours on the road, I'm able to devote that time. And companies are also happy because they don't have to run infrastructure, operate canteens, maintain a workforce. So they're just saying, okay, you work from home. And for a salary they were paying for 8 hours, 9 hours office time, they now literally are able to extract 24/7 work from the individuals and pay the same amount. So obviously a company profit goes up. So, but is that sustainable? Is another thing. Second is our houses meant to be a place where we work from home? Right? Then again, schooling from home, children unable to go outside and play, those sort of things, social distancing and stuff like that. The other parameters I've already touched about: hunger, poverty, land scarcity, economic issues, climate change, of course, right? And I'll come to solar now. That solar is not easy to harness, right? And this was from a paper we published. It's the most cited paper connected with photovoltaics and impact of dust, right? And what we find is that there are some parameters we can control. That is the parameters which are in the rounded boxes, the way we install it, the geometry of the installation and things like that. But on the commercially available photovoltaic panels, we cannot control material efficiency. We cannot control glass transmittance. We can't control environmental factors, right? When it is going to rain, dust and things like that. So even in a roof like this, there are limitations. And in fact, after we started building this roof in 2006 is when we wrote up that paper. And here again, we found when we wanted to install the roof, we had to clear the forest, the branches and things like that, because otherwise it would shadow the panel. And a shadowed panel, energy output will be much lower. And when the panels are connected in an array, one panel being shadowed affects the output of the entire system. And in Bangalore, and this is something that I'm sure you will find only in India, that people put photovoltaic panel below trees, and expect them to function. And these are to operate our traffic lights, And people, this is the problem with attitude again. Bangalore at one time was called a garden city. Trees are disappearing. You don't want to cut trees. At the same time, you want to install solar. And what happens is that the solar system will maybe function for about 3 months, 4 months without cleaning under the tree. Leaves will gather on the panels. And then that's about it. Nobody cares. Nobody bothers. And so these are the overall factors. Dust is a serious problem in India. And particularly when we are integrating photovoltaics in buildings or photovoltaics on terraces, the geometry of the clusters of building has a bearing on the wind. And that geometry will affect how the wind carries dust and causes it to settle on these panels. We took up some study on this, but then we didn't pursue it in terms of how the geometry of the city will affect the dust on the panels. And when the panels get dusty, their output goes down and you need to use more water for cleaning them. Those are the cycles that we get into. This is again work where panels which are installed on the roadside, you will find that the soot that comes from vehicular emissions depositing on them causes a significant reduction, 80% drop in their output, right? And cleaning soot from photovoltaic panels is not so easy. So this is a problem with dust, where you have microscopic particles. Some are really, you can see with your naked eye. And what we tried to do was, can we avoid using water for cleaning? So what we did is that we used our regular, in the middle of the picture, you will see a palm leaf broom, which is very common in villages. And we found that that broom is very effective in clearing dust. And we reduced the need for water from 50, that is 500 ml to 50 ml. That's a lot. And we tested this and we found that that broom is very effective. And not only that, when we put the edges of the broom under a SEM, electron microscope, we found that the edges of that particular broom is very hard, and it's like shark's teeth. Every time it gets chipped, the edges become sharper and sharper. So they maintain their cleaning effectiveness also. Right? It's a very simple thing we've understood, and then but then today people are looking at robots for cleaning and microfiber cloth and things like that. Now that is also causing additional problems with plastics in the environment, microplastics in the environment. Even the placenta of newborns now has microplastics, right? So we don't know what sort of health impacts that is going to have on us, but we'll have to, of course, foresee that and plan for that. Yeah. So now coming from the point of view of building integration and photovoltaics, we had tried to come up with a matrix and see how we can integrate photovoltaics either as part of the building envelope or on the building, like a terrace or a facade. And we had, say, for example, low-rise buildings or low-density buildings. So if you look at low-rise, low-density buildings, these will usually be villas, very rich people, huge land, but their energy requirement will be very high, right? If you look at medium-rise, medium-density, these are about 6-story, 7-story apartment blocks. Again, if you were to put photovoltaics on the roof, we will find that the energy requirement generated can only matter, they can manage their lift, maybe their local, the street lights, corridor lights and things like that. If you're looking at low-rise, high-density, we're looking at slum areas. And slum areas, the energy requirements are very less. They might want to charge their mobile phone, run a mixie, right? And where, if you look at any picture of a slum across the world, you will only see the roof, right? You will never see the side walls of any slum. And you will see that the roof area, probably about, 10 square meters or even less than that, is enough to meet, you put a photovoltaic panel there, is enough to meet their energy requirement. Right? So we are working on configurations like this. And in fact, the student who submitted and got a PhD, working on building integrated photovoltaics, later went to Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory to look and see how photovoltaics can be integrated and made more economically viable. Now we are coming to the other part which the country is now waking up to, is what happens with photovoltaic panel waste, right? India still doesn't, now the ministry, MNRE is looking at a waste management plan or an end-of-life management plan for photovoltaics, right? And India is likely to generate about 7.5 million tons of photovoltaic waste, right? And we don't know what to do with it. It's like our Tetra Pak juice packets, right? Because it's neither glass, we have a laminate at the back, we have silicon, and as of now, if you go to a waste, which we call a junkyard, you will see a lot of photovoltaic panels are now dumped there. And it doesn't have the value it had before. And a lot of the solar power plants are decommissioning the solar panels if their efficiency goes down from 12% to 10%, because it's not economically viable anymore and they would have recovered their cost by then. And it is there we came up with this idea, because the roof that we had, which we did in 2006, we replaced it because the panels had deteriorated very fast. And we upgraded a 5 kilowatt system to a 9 kilowatt system. And we were wondering what to do with that 5 kilowatt panels. And then we came up with an idea saying, why not use it like a building material, right? And that's exactly what we did. We actually are testing photovoltaics as a building material now. And it's featured a couple of news articles that have there. And unfortunately, the COVID prevented us from continuing work in this area. And what we're trying to do is trying to see if in what ways can photovoltaic panels be used, right? So we made a table out of it. That's the table that you saw in the second slide that I had shown. You can use it like a small panel, so you can use it like a chopping board and things like that. And now there's a doctoral student looking at the thermal transmittance from these panels and how it will affect the indoor thermal comfort. In fact, he also got the Bhavan's fellowship to go to Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, because they were also interested to take up work in this area. But again, due to the COVID, the fellowship was withdrawn. So unfortunately, the student is unable to go, but we'll see. I think we're still progressing on experimental investigations in this area. Now, the last aspect that we're dealing with is sanitation. And like I said, I'll be covering the work that we did in the tsunami affected island. And what happened was that in 2004, when the tsunami struck, 2005 early, we were approached by a group called the Center for Environment Education. And they said that we want to provide sanitation to this island village. And when we visited them, we found that it was a very big island, very small community, fishermen. And we said, you leave them alone because, sanitation is not a serious problem there. And they were using some firewood for cooking. The fishermen will get up in the morning, go to the boat, they will defecate in the open and then take the, fishing nets and go. And the women will also go in groups, chit chat and there, so see, open defecation is a contextual thing. Yes, from a social stigma point of view, from a modern lifestyle point of view, it's not acceptable, right? But that's exactly what we do when we go for trekking in the forest area or when we are out in nature, right? Because that's a very primal instinct, one. Second is farmers have always been doing it all along because it turns into compost and that's about it. And original Gandhian way was actually saying that you dig a small pit and, use that. But when you come to congested areas, slum areas, their open defecation is a serious social stigma. It's also unhygienic because then, what the WHO says, the fecal oral transmission. Children run around, they will touch some droppings and they put the hand in the mouth and then there is a problem. Then you need sanitation or improved sanitation, right? So they said, no, you have to provide something here. And then we went and saw that the water table was very high. They had good drinking water at about 4 feet, 5 feet level. And we said, okay, then given all these conditions, we will provide eco-san or ecological sanitation, where you use the toilet, the ash that is generated in the kitchen by burning firewood, you use it in the toilet. And it gets composted very easily and you don't have to worry about groundwater contaminations and things like that. And when we proposed that, they refused. They said, see, you guys use flushing system and all of that and you are asking us to take ash and go, we will not use it. So then we went back, redesigned the whole thing and we came up with this thing called a modified compact septic tank. We won recognition from the Suez Environment Foundation for this. We also have a patent on this. And what we tried to do was that to see if the wastewater leaving the septic tank can be dispersed close to the surface of the soil so that it evaporates rather than going down. So we made an impervious layer below the pipe. And the second part we also thought of was the flooding that likely happens because of tsunami, tidal waves and rain. Can we design something that the toilets will function despite this flooding? And so these are the only sanitation units naturally designed, naturally meaning passively designed, to function even once the flood water fills the whole toilet and once the water recedes, the toilets will resume functioning, right? And that's because we have a small post-filtration chamber which regulates the level of the water in the septic tank. We built about 140 of these way back in 2006 and 7, 2006 to be precise. And I visited that place in 2017-18 and I found that nearly 60% of those toilets are still in operation. And you can see the pictures, kitchen garden is behind the, the toilets and, using the nutrients coming from the septic tank. So these were construction pictures way back that we did. Even in congested areas, we were able to build these toilets. And the acceptance levels were very high. And in rural Karnataka here, we are also looking at rammed earth or a soil-based construction using a composting technique where the water, the whole peninsular part of India, the water table used to be very high. But once we started irrigation and using a lot of pumps to draw water from the ground, it started going down from 30 feet to 600 feet to 800 feet. That is a problem. So here now, since the groundwater table is very low, we can actually go with the pits in the soil and allow the contaminating the groundwater. Now I was telling you about attitude here, and this is again my experience with the tsunami-related construction. What we found is that attitude plays a critical role in the way people relate to the built environment. Now, these toilets were constructed in a place called Kadalur by UNICEF, and they constructed 2 bays of toilets, 1 bay for men, 1 bay for women. There's a hand pump on the right, and the idea was that you take a bucket, fill the water with the hand pump, go use the toilet. Nobody used these toilets. And they started using the space in between the toilet for privacy to defecate in the open, right? And when I went and spoke to them, they said, "Sir, why are you wasting money providing toilets? You give us a room. I don't need a toilet anyway. Anyway, I'm going to, the seashore is so nice. I prefer to go in the open." And that's what they will do, right? And many of the other places where toilets were built, they were constructed to store firewood, because for them, seeing that the firewood is kept dry is very important. And they say your toilets don't leak. There is a roof over it. I will go outside for my toilet related needs, but I will use it to store firewood, right? And the same happened to 3 or 4 of our toilets. One got converted to a kitchen, the other got converted to a place to store cow dung cakes and things like that. So finally, when we bring in technology, this many of us will be able to relate to about 10 years back, when for an incoming call I had to pay. I remember 2002, 2003, mobile phone Airtel had come. The calling charges were 6 rupees 70 paise a minute outgoing or incoming, and a minute was the minimum charge. That if you talk for 1 second also, it was charged for 1 minute, right? And that time Indians were, came up with this whole idea of missed call as a means of communicating. That is, I'll give you 2 rings to say I'm home. I'll give you 1 ring to say that I'm ready, things like that. So that's the way people will start relating to technology, and they will try to use it in the most cost-effective manner. Again, on the sanitation side, this whole issue of manual, cleaning and things like that, this is something that we started in 2011, but like we said, given our constraints as academics, we can't focus on everything and take everything to commercial success. So we try to develop a sewer boat, a sewer cleaning system, which can clean these sewer systems, inspect them without having the need for people to go in. So this was the entire system that we actually even filed a patent for. Is that it's all connected using your mobile. You have a device which will first inspect the manhole to check if there are cracks, where the clog is, how deep is the clog when you come in from the dry side. And then you send the sewer cleaning boat, which will go inspect the nature of clog. So you developed a small probe which will tell you whether it is debris or whether it's cloth. And accordingly, the head is put there to clear it, right? We made a prototype. This is the inspection unit that we made with a water bottle, stainless steel water bottle. And all this information is connected via Bluetooth, and you get data on your mobile phone. And for now, we only wanted to check the acidity, the temperature of the, if you're putting this into a manhole which is covered, to understand whether there are toxic chemicals or toxic gases coming out. We can upgrade those sensors here. And this was a sewer cleaning system that we developed. This is the prototype 3. And like I said, I wanted to actually take a year off and work with the team, and get this commercialized. But then the COVID came, and then we were not able to take it further. And it's for this that we actually won the Lexus Design Award. And let us see. I think there's a social obligation that we have as engineers or designers to deal with societal problems. And I think I will close with these slides. in terms of green technologies or sustainability today, people are saying low energy, but then how low is low, right? Again, pollution, low impact. And the example here is that in a city traffic, it doesn't really matter which car you drive, right? You drive the most fuel efficient car or the worst fuel efficient car in traffic. When you're moving at 3 kilometer, 5 kilometer per hour effective speed, it doesn't really matter what vehicle you drive, right? The pollution is still the same. So where does efficiency matter, right? And that is where we need to look at effectiveness versus efficiency, right? And effectiveness is, at the end of the day, reducing our per capita energy footprint. Unless we tackle it there, I don't think the issue of sustainability will be addressed. And tackling it there means that we start leading a lifestyle that is not a consumerist, or because consumerism is fundamental to our economy. If people don't consume and buy cars, we will not go get jobs. I won't get job as an automobile engineer. So it's a very difficult fix we are in, where the solution is we don't know. And like I said, we are also looking at efficiency versus effectiveness and their limitations. So I will stop with this, and I'll be happy to take any questions if you have.
Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us with a lot of knowledge on sustainability, particularly rural areas, how these taxi groups, how they are energy efficient, and other slums, and comparing with the second, third, two-story, three-story buildings, and many other sewer cleaning equipments. So many things that you were explaining about those things, how they are really, how much they contribute to sustainable developments. Thank you very much, sir. So now I would like to participants to ask any doubts. Participants, can you raise your doubts? If you have any doubts, you can either you can chat, you can type in the chatting, or you can directly unmute yourself and you can ask. Could you please? So, Dr. Montamani, sir, you said something, whatever that we are going to take actions for sustainable development, that will be, become effective only after some 15-20 years.
50 years.
50 years. Then what will happen to the near future, sir? You suppose
we don't know. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. Now, this is actually I got to know from a professor who works on climate change.
Okay.
The climate, particularly if you look at evolution,
Yes, sir.
For them 100 years is nothing. They will look at 1,000 years.
Okay.
500 years will be their minimum unit.
Yes, yes.
So even in climate change, if you look at, people have been talking about from the 1970s.
Yes, sir.
Only now, because it is causing problems, floods and hurricanes and all that disruption,
Yes.
crop being affected and productivity and things like that, that we are worrying about it.
Yeah.
And these are consequences that is because of activities from industrialization.
Yes.
So if we have to undo it, we cannot take action now and expect the climate to be fixed immediately.
Yes, exactly. Yes, sir.
It will take a response time. and that response time is 50 years minimum.
Yes, okay, sir. Okay. Yeah, already it is caused irreversible damage now.
Yes,
To
yes,
reverse it, it will take a lot of
yes.
years.
So what is going to happen in the next 50 years is very unclear. The
Yes.
climate models are giving you various, there is some consistency among the climate models in terms of severity of rainfall, drought, water scarcity, higher temperatures, glacial melts,
Yes, sir.
right? All that is consistent. Whether we will be able to reverse it 50 years from now or all of us will go to Mars, we don't know.
Or at least we have to get ready, prepared to face those problems.
Yes, yes.
And also we have to look for some remedial measures also, how to overcome those problems.
I think remedial measures are difficult unless and otherwise. See, the problem with, from a philosophical angle, the problem with the human mind is the intellect.
Yes.
If we were not intelligent and we were just stupid, I think, we would have been perfectly fine, I think.
Yeah. So participants, it's open for discussion. If you have any doubts, you can please put forth. I think it was very clear, sir, whatever you explained.
I would assume that.
Yeah. So
Okay, thank you so much. I think then I can.
thank you so much, sir, for your excellent presentation on this sustainability challenges are in buildings.
Yeah.
So, with a very practical knowledge, all your practical knowledge you brought to us, exposed us to how they are sustainable. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll sign off now. Thank you so much.
Okay, sir. Next speaker is from